doing great.
It's better because he has to fix your mic.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Elliot Gerson, and on behalf of the Aspen Institute, I would like to welcome all of you to this, our fourth Aspen Environment Forum. For those of you who haven't been to Aspen before, welcome to Aspen. Welcome to our last day of winter, and I am told on very good authority that tomorrow will be the beginning of summer. Actually, it should be in the 80s for the rest of the week. So you can see that there never is much of a spring for those people who live here in Aspen. We're thrilled about the forum. We're thrilled it's back. You're going to have a fabulous panel this evening. I would also like to offer a special welcome to listeners. This is being broadcast live on Aspen Public Radio. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our co-host and co-sponsor of this, represented by Victoria Pope, the Deputy Editor of the National Geographic, who will introduce what is to come. Victoria?
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here today. It's finally happening. A group of us from the Aspen Institute and from National Geographic Society have been working since last fall to bring you this forum. We invited an impressive roster of thinkers from university, media, think tanks, and the private sector. Oh, and don't forget government. And we are thrilled by the caliber and professional range of the speakers, moderators, and sponsors. Early on in our planning, we knew we would want to carve out a session on coping with calamity, but it wasn't until the tsunami hit Japan this past March that we decided to make it the subject of this opening session. Quite frankly, we asked ourselves, was the subject too glum to kick this session off, to kick the forum off with? But that concern was quickly replaced by the intellectual curiosity that we felt about the subject, an intellectual curiosity that I know you all share. What are the ways in which we, all 7 billion of us, can build resilience into our complex world? How do we learn to prepare for and avoid calamity rather than be surprised or despairing of it? I can think of no one better than Joel Achenbach to moderate this important session. Joel is a staff writer at the Washington Post and the author of many books. He has covered disasters, man-made, natural, with great distinction. Joel writes with humor and wit, traits that have been challenged, but I'm glad to say, not entirely submerged by the gravity of the events he's covered recently. I turn this now over to Joel.
Thank you, Victoria. And thank you all for coming tonight and braving the late winter snowstorm and whatever, the volcano out there somewhere. I mean, it's just, we live in very interesting times. So thanks for being here. And we've got a panel here that I can honestly say, these are some of my heroes. These are giants in their field. we're going to get right to it. Let me just say that I did just finish a book about one disaster last year, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. When I came back to work, 2 days later, there was this terrible tragedy in Japan, which you've all seen the YouTubes on that. This unbelievable wall of water coming in destroys these towns and villages and cities, and then it triggers a technological disaster. We've also seen this terrible set of tornado outbreaks this spring. There's a flood on the Mississippi River right now that may not technically be a disaster, but it has pushed the system to its very brim, its limit, literally, and we're one levee failure away from a jackpot there. Can y'all hear me? Okay. We've had earthquakes that have been absolutely devastating in recent years. We've had Hurricane Katrina. We had the Indonesian tsunami that devastated Sumatra. In 1800, there was one city in the world with 1 million people in it. Today, there are 381 cities with at least 1 million people, and some of them have 20 million people, and many of them, like Caracas or Mexico City or Tehran or Kathmandu, are sitting in extremely hazardous seismic zones. So what we know is that we are going to see more disasters to come. And what I would unfortunately, so what do we do about that? What I'd like to do is have the panelists just take a minute to talk about how you think of this issue. To what extent is this something we have made for ourselves? A quick thought on how we should be thinking about this in the long term. So we'll start with Tom Lovejoy, who is, I'd like to say, among other many accomplished things, as a dean of conservation biology. He is the first conservation fellow of the Geographic Society. Is that correct?
It is indeed.
Tom Lovejoy.
Thanks. So I've had a pet peeve for a very long time, which is most of these events are usually referred to as natural disasters. And thank you very much. They're partly natural, but they're also partly the doing of our own kind, putting ourselves in particularly vulnerable situations. And a really interesting thing in Japan, there are things known as Tsunami Stones, which are from past tsunamis, and they just sort of sit out there and nobody pays too much attention, but it says you really shouldn't build a house below this altitude, right? So they ignored their past. So that's one point. Second point is, as you pour more energy into the global system, you're going to have more events, and we'll get into that later. But I think even more important is, as we keep heating the planet, we're setting ourselves up for even bigger natural, quote-unquote, natural disasters, such as dieback of the southern and eastern part of the Amazon. So enough from me.
Okay. To Tom's right is Marcia McNutt, who is the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, and she is an accomplished marine geophysicist. Is that correct? She has been in scientific submersibles to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean 2 miles down. She ran the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute for, I believe, at least about a dozen years, and is now the top geologist with the U.S. government, who last year, when all the craziness happened in the Gulf of Mexico, they basically said to Marcia, we need you to go to Houston and solve this problem. And although she did not go down personally to the bottom of the ocean and plug the Deepwater Horizon well, that might have been a good idea, she was there day in, day out, working unbelievable hours, trying to figure out what's the best path forward in a crisis that was 87 days from the night that the well blew out to the night to the day they finally cranked close the new cap on the well and stopped the spill. It wasn't over then, because actually a lot of the really exciting stuff happened after they closed the well, and they weren't sure if it was blowing out down at depth, creating an even worse situation. But she is a dedicated public servant and a great scientist. So what do you think about disasters, having lived through one last year?
Well, thank you, Joel. The U.S. Geological Survey is the nation's science agency that has the responsibility for the science of natural disasters. And there's probably no director of the U.S. Geological Survey that has had more natural disasters under her watch than myself. So my so-called friends at NOAA have called me the master of disaster. Anyway, in terms of the natural disasters that we're seeing, statistically, in terms of earthquakes at least, it's not out of the ordinary in terms of the number we've seen. But the truth is that, just as Joel said, more and more people are being put in harm's way, and that is why we are seeing larger economic toll and larger death toll from the number of disasters. Our approach at the U.S. Geological Survey to the kinds of disasters we're seeing, whether it's tsunamis, whether it's wildfires, whether it's earthquakes or any other kind of disaster, is to do something that we call scenario planning. And that is, we look back into Earth's record to try to understand, excuse me, what kind of disasters can happen, even if they haven't happened during our memory. Because the Earth does keep a record of what has happened. And then we try to understand, if that disaster were to happen again, how would it interact with society? And that way we can try to prepare for what can we do were it to happen again. An excellent example is the arc storm scenario that we just went through for a giant flood. When it happened in the past, it inundated the entire Central Valley of California. And if it were to happen again, it would be a multi-billion-dollar disaster. It would take out 1 of every 4 buildings in all of California. And so, obviously we have to understand what we can do to both scientifically and from an economic standpoint to prevent that sort of disaster. Now, one of the challenges in scenario planning is the fact that the uniformitarian concept of the past being the key to the future may not always be the dominant way we can look at it. Because wildfires, for example, are not necessarily uniformitarian. Wildfires that happened in the geologic past may not be the same wildfires that happen in the future due to the way we're managing forests. We know that wildfires actually are, in many cases, worse because of some of our forest management practices and because of the way the humans encroach on forests. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you. Our next speaker is Stewart Brand, who, as you may know, invented the internet, or dang close to it. He is the co-founder and president of the Long Now Foundation. He's the co-founder of the Global Business Network. I think most famously, he wrote and started the Whole Earth Catalog back in 1968.
Got it.
And has been a visionary for a long time and was an early proponent of the PC as a revolutionary tool that would transform society and empower individuals. And it's a great honor to have Stewart here.
After I got out of the Army, I kept skydiving. And pretty shortly after that, I had a single malfunction. My parachute did not open, and that alerted me to the fact that things can go very bad very quickly. It was not a double malfunction. My reserve opened and training cut in, and I did the right thing. The next event like that was 1989. We had a relatively mild earthquake in the Bay Area, but it was not mild in one part of town, which was basically Phil, In the Marina District, we had a number of buildings down. I happened to be driving by at the time, and I wound up being a volunteer for the first hour there while we were trying to get people out of these collapsed and burning buildings. And what I discovered and later wrote about was that volunteers are absolutely the rescuers of first and in many cases last resort. And what you want is volunteers to be ready in advance for helping not only themselves and their family, but each other. And so one of the things that came out of that quake was the neighborhood emergency response teams, the community emergency response teams, and people are getting trained in how to manage these kinds of disasters at the very local level. And lots more of that, I think, is called for. On the other hand, some of the stuff we're looking at now is not that something bad that happens in an afternoon and is cleared up in a month. It's bad stuff that happens in a century and takes a century to straighten out. Bill McKibben has pointed out that the environmental movement is morphing into the climate change movement, and that's just right, because that affects biodiversity, it affects all the things we care about. And it's a different environmental problem in the sense that it has this century or multi-century scale. And we're used to sort of responding things in a year or maybe decade level, but this is this other thing. Most of society is not geared to thinking in century terms. The political system, at least in the democracies, is not good at it. The economic system is not good at it. So in a way, it's environmentalists who are looking at hopefully the long term of how life is managed and the long term of how life needs to manage that can take on a century scale problem like this. Now, since I invented the internet, I will add just one other black swan that might come in sideways on all of us, and that is that the internet is probably more brittle than all of us thought. And one of the things you can do when you're running scenarios is how do you manage whatever it is you're trying to manage if the internet is down for a day. Basically, the only communication in the United States that is guaranteed if the internet goes down is between the President of the United States and the missile silos. Everything else is up for grabs. If it's down for a week, it starts to become a calamity. If it's down for 2 weeks and can't get back up, then you've got a different world. So on that happy note, I hand things off to Bill, who has good news.
Okay, before we go on, can y'all hear okay? Is the sound okay? Yeah. Hear him back?
Raise your hand or shout if it's
In the back?
you can't hear. Come forward.
Turn it up a little bit. Okay. Okay, good, good. All right, so our last panelist is Bill McKibben, who was, even when he was in college at a student newspaper, I was reading his stuff thinking, wow, this guy has amazing talent. Right out of college, he went to work for The New Yorker, which recognized that he was a special voice. His book, The End of Nature, which came out in 1989, was the first book to call attention to global warming. In those days, it was called The Greenhouse Effect. And that is a landmark book, and I think since then he's written a dozen books and has established himself as probably the most significant, or on the very short list of one or two people, significant environmental writers and influential environmental writers on the planet today that I know of. And he's now sort of becoming more of an activist. He has founded a group called 350.org, which is committed to trying to get the planet back to what is perceived to be a safer level of carbon dioxide concentration of 350 parts per million. And it's a great honor to have Bill McKibben.
What a pleasure to see you and to be with this panel and to be here. I'm going to begin by apologizing for the fact that I'm leaving tonight or tomorrow morning, and I'm not going to get to see most of this great week of stuff. I'm going off to Bellingham, Washington tomorrow because there's Marcia's the other side of the Interior Department, not the USGS. Earlier this year decided that they would open a huge part of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming to coal mining, about 750 million tons. of coal, but to get that coal out to China, to sell it to China, they need a deep water port someplace on the Pacific. And so Bellingham is one of the early candidates, and there's people there organizing to fight it. And I'm going to be there because, and this plays into this question very directly, I think the most important thing we can be talking about is how we're going to prevent preventable disaster going forward. When I wrote that first book about climate change 20 years ago, we knew the basics of what was happening. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put CO2 in the atmosphere, and we knew CO2 trapped heat that radiated back out to space. The only thing we didn't know was how fast and how hard it was going to pinch, and the story of the last 20 years is it's pinching harder and faster than we would have guessed. Now, there's a long list of calamities that you rattled off at the beginning, Joel, and I'm afraid it could go on even longer, but there probably is an important distinction to be made between the ones that remain more or less natural disasters, sort of tectonic and volcanic forces, and the ones that are deeply beginning to bear the human thumbprint. Now, we don't know all of these. As Andy Revkin pointed out, we don't this week, we don't have great data on tornadoes, say, but we have great understanding of what's going on in the planet's hydrological cycle. The atmosphere is about 4% wetter than it was 40 years ago because of the extra heat we've put out. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That loads the dice for deluge and downpour and flood. And in the last 18 months, country after country has crapped out in that dice game. Most spectacularly, probably Pakistan, which saw something like a quarter of the country underwater at the height of the floods along the Indus last year. But one could name an almost endless list. Maybe the most poignant recent stuff came from the president of the country of Colombia last week, who said, we've had so much rain here, apparently, by far, by an enormous margin, the rainiest year in their history. So it's basically wiped out 15 years, 20 years of development in this country. That's what the development officials were saying. Too many bridges gone, too many roads wiped out. We're committed to a lot of trouble already. The temperature of the planet has increased 1 degree, and there's roughly another degree in the pipeline from carbon we've already emitted. That extra energy is going to cause all kinds of problems that climatologists have been warning and predicting about. What we still have some ability to influence is whether or not this century will be miserable or close to impossible. And the climatologists are pretty robust in their consensus that if we don't get our act together much more quickly than our political systems are at the moment thinking about it, we're going to see that temperature increase be more on the order of 4 or 5 degrees. And if that happens, the range of calamity we can expect is enormous, and it begins with things that we don't even really think about at the moment as calamities because they happen a little more slowly. But there have been recent papers, agronomists saying that the rule of thumb is, in their world now, they're thinking you might see a 10% decline in grain yields for each degree Celsius that you increase the temperature of the planet. That's a slow motion but profound disaster. Merely the drought in Russia last year, the floods in Australia, the current drought in China, and the inability to get corn in the fields in the Midwest, and the death of much of the winter wheat crop in Texas have been enough to drive grain prices in the last year up about 70 or 80%. And that means for a couple of billion people around the world right now, there's a sort of ongoing disaster 3 times a day as they try to figure out how they're going to pay for food. So we have to figure out, I guess what I'm trying to say is, to quote someone who I've now forgotten who said it first, but it was a good formulation. We need to figure out, and it's important work, how to adapt to that which we can't prevent. And so that means warning systems and new places, ways of building things, and so on. But we even more desperately need to figure out how to prevent that to which we cannot adapt. And the key to that prevention is staunching the flow of carbon into the atmosphere right now, which is a, above all, political project and a tough one.
All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to banter back and forth here. I'm going to ask a few questions, but no one on the panel should feel constrained. Don't be polite. Go ahead and jump in and say, but wait, I have an objection to that. So we're going to talk, okay? And then we're going to open up to questions. So in just a little bit. So prepare your questions. Let me start with Marcia. Yes, the geological record gives us an idea of what has happened before and helps us create a hazard map. How good are our hazard maps? Not just in terms of seismic hazard, but I mean, I can't help but think about what happened in Japan, where the Japan Trench, because of a theory about the age of that part of the tectonic plate, it was not considered to be capable of more than an 8.4 magnitude event. And it had a 9.0, which I believe is 6 times more powerful, or the total energy is even more than that. I mean, it's a much more powerful event. It's the difference between a disaster and the kind of historic catastrophe that we saw when more than 20,000 people died. It may be the most expensive natural disaster in the history of the planet. I can't think of what else would rival it in terms of property damage. And so my question is, are we overconfident in our understanding of what the world might throw at us? I mean, we talk about black swan events. Only in the last 30 years have people understood the Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific Northwest, how it could generate a massive tsunami. What else are we going to discover in the coming years that is lurking, under our radar?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the tsunami in Sendai really shouldn't have been a surprise, because there were tsunami deposits that showed that exact same tsunami had happened in that exact same valley in the exact same way. So I think, but it was back in 800. So the problem was that it was a very long time period.
Isn't it true that there was a desire in Japan to know what the next big catastrophe would be, and they were prepared for a catastrophe along a different fault, the Nankai Trough, and that conceivably they could have been overconfident in their assessment of the seismic hazard and not built their tsunami walls high enough at Fukushima, for example?
I think you're right, and what the question is are you so focused on your nearest term probability that you don't look at what is a lower probability but still very high impact event? Right. And I think that is where scenario planning can help you say, this is still a possibility, and if it happens, this would be disastrous. And there are 2 very simple things that could have been done in Sendai. One is to understand that the system they had for backup cooling for those power plants wasn't going to work if the generators were underwater. So find a way to have backup power that didn't rely on generators that were at sea level. Mm-hmm. And secondly, have a vertical evacuation that didn't involve moving people kilometers inland, because vertical evacuation is understood to be the best way. Now, it has to be sturdy structures for waves of that height, but they could calculate what would be the force of the known wave that had come up the Sendai Valley before.
Stewart, you mentioned, go ahead, you have a comment.
I want to say something about scenario planning. I've done it professionally at Global Business Network for, it's 20 years now. And there's an interesting problem with scenario planning, which is that typically you do a matrix and 4 scenarios or something like that. And for a scenario to be effective in terms of a better, more robust adaptive strategy, all the scenarios have to be plausible. Reality has no such constraint. And so the stuff that really gets you is the stuff that you cannot sell to the people you're doing scenarios for, because they'll say, that's ridiculous, that would never happen. But if you look at just look at what scenarios deal in is a realm of things that are considered probable, which is great. You get away from the official future of things are going to go the way we want or the way we're organized to handle. That's good. It separates you from that. But you only look at the probable things. There's this whole huge universe of things that you're pretty sure are impossible, but there's so many of them that every now and then one of them actually comes to pass. And scenarios don't help with that. So, and typically scenarios are good about as far as maybe 40 years, and then things are just too weird after that, so that you're just telling each other anecdotes. So the scenarios are important, but it's also important to bear in mind that they will get you only so far. They will only get you to the probable and the plausible problems, but not to the seemingly impossible or to the long-range problems.
Right. I agree.
Question for both Tom and Bill. Stewart mentioned earlier that we're not good at thinking in century time scales. And maybe we're not really good at thinking beyond the next election, beyond 2012. We're going to have a big election. And I think the Mayan calendar has some kind of bad news now that I think about it. So Tom, Bill, both of you are interested in issues that are near term, but also have really dire consequences, in particular over the long term, when it's harder to get people to wrap their brains around it. What do we do to be better at making decisions that help us in the long term, and to have political structures that are not beholden to the next, New Hampshire primary?
So I don't know about political structures, but I think the issue is that we still tend to think in the very short term and locally, when in fact we are disturbing global systems in the way the planet actually works. And so I think we've actually got ourselves to the point that we need to consciously manage the planet, not get to the end of the year and add everything up and call it management, but think literally about, is there a way to get some of that CO2 that's up there as an excess burden, half of which came from the destruction of natural ecosystems over 3 centuries? Is there a way we can manage the planet so some of that comes back and we get closer to the 350 goal, which I totally agree with Bill about?
The problem is not, yes, there's a problem with short-term thinking and that sort of thing. But we've actually had the interesting experience. We started this thing, 350.org, 3 years ago when the NASA team said this is the number that we need to be at, And at the time, we sort of said to ourselves, it's crazy to choose a number like this. It's too hard for people to wrap their heads around it, too scientific, except that we did it because we were trying to organize globally and Arabic numerals translate across language boundaries. Well, it turns out that people all over the world are completely capable of coping with the science. We've had twice now what CNN called the most widespread days of political action in the planet's history. Last October, we had 7,400 demonstrations in 189 countries, every place but North Korea, all right? All around this scientific data point. The problem is partly that kind of the human brain isn't, but it's also partly the fact that there is an enormous political power behind the fossil fuel industry that keeps us doing bad things that we know are bad things. So, we elect good people. President Barack Obama said, with my election, the waters will begin to recede. But then the political power is enough that the Department of the Interior says, go ahead and mine coal in this, huge swath of Wyoming. It's quite probable that later this year, the Secretary of State will say it's okay to build a pipeline from the tar sands in Alberta down to Texas. This is a 1,500-mile fuse on the biggest carbon bomb on the planet. It is, in anything that we know about the science, just crazy. So the only way, politically, the only way to deal with this in the end, I think, since we're never going to outspend the fossil fuel industry, is to build a political movement. And it'll be, in some ways, it's a kind of final exam. Are we going to be able to muster is the big brain and the big heart, hopefully attached to it, enough to help us cope with the big, and so far, the evidence is not good. So far, we are losing this fight, and we are pouring carbon into the atmosphere. The IEA said today that we managed to set a new record for pouring carbon into the atmosphere last year. The recession didn't slow us down hardly a bit, So we're losing, and we will lose until there's a movement, and I'll just end by saying, it's one thing to talk about all the deep, long future and all of that. If we don't get this flow of carbon into the atmosphere under control soon, then the die will be cast for what that future looks like, and there'll be no particular point in having, Environmental Forum 44 and discussing climate change, because if we haven't done something about it by then, we won't going to be doing something about it at that point.
Question, Bill, that Tom Lovejoy raised carbon capture, and I assume you're focusing on a lot of these things. Is biochar, pyrolyzing plant waste and turning it into charcoal that goes in the ground and stays there thousands of years?
It looks like there's a bunch of things that we know about that can probably help some, sort of drain the bathtub a little bit. Biochar may be useful if it's done the right way. It may turn out to be a big problem if it's done the wrong way on a kind of industrial scale. On a kind of, well, I mean, if you, this is a sort of side discussion, but there's a long list of other things too. I think probably more interesting are what we're figuring out about soils and how we can make arid soils a lot healthier. And there's sort of interesting new science on things like grazing of ungulates and what happens if you, but the point is draining the bathtub is a useful strategy once you've turned off the tap, that's pouring more water in. But the obvious first thing to be doing is not sort of deluding yourselves about all the nifty things you're coming up with to drain the bathtub while the water is still pouring in. And until we get serious carbon policy, that's exactly the position we're in.
I mean, to what extent is technology capable of fixing this problem? Now, Tom, you've written about geoengineering, but the kind of geoengineering you favor is a little more smaller in scale and less susceptible to unintended consequences, as I understand it. Can you describe that?
So, my concern is we're going to get ourselves further and further on this trajectory, and then there will be some really horrible calamity, and then everybody's going to be rushing around, we got to do something, and we'll snatch at geoengineering, which basically means engineering at the scale of the planet and doing things like throwing a lot of sulfates up in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight. And those kinds of schemes basically only treat the symptom, they don't treat the cause. And unless you have something that treats the cause, you're neglecting the 2/3 of the planet, which are the oceans, which are getting increasingly acid. So it seems to me that there are some smaller scale geoengineering things one can do, maybe could slow down the melting in the Arctic region. But I think in the end, what we really need to do is work with the natural systems of the planet. And I guess the only thing I would disagree with Bill about is I think we have to be both drawing down and pushing on reducing the further filling of the bathtub at the same time.
I don't disagree with you about that.
Yeah.
That's true.
What about getting back to disasters per se? To what extent should we focus on mitigation? For example, we've been talking about climate change here and the effects it has, but in the meantime, there are more and more people who are living in places that are susceptible to flooding or to sea level rise, either due to poverty or just because the governments encourage that. There are people who live in unsafe structures, who have are in tornado-prone areas. You have obviously many hundreds of millions of people living in seismically hazardous places. I think the number that I saw for a story I did was about 500 million people live in places that are, very, very seismically hazardous. So this is not a classic environment issue. It's more of a development issue. But what do you do about trying to keep people from having the roof fall on their head or having their house blow away with them inside of it because they have no basement or no safe room? To what extent does the environmental movement need to take into account short-term mitigation of people who are sitting in the line of fire?
So I have a reaction to that. I think there's some really serious humanitarian aspects of that in the poorer parts of the world. But in a place like the United States, one thing you could do is stop having all of us through our taxes underwriting people building, on the shoreline near rising sea levels. Right?
Yeah, and I'd say that what's happened in the earthquake community can be used as a good example, and that is that the scientists have worked with engineers, who have worked with architects, who have worked with city planners to make sure that they understand where the seismic hazards are. That's been translated into understanding of strong ground motion, which has been translated into engineering standards for design for buildings, and that has gotten into the building standards for communities. And over the decades then, communities have become earthquake hardened, and that then has resulted in insurance practices where if your building is built to the standards, your earthquake premiums are very low, such that it pays you for the extra 5% that you have to spend to put that earthquake standard into your building, and so it's well worth it to build a building that will withstand an earthquake. And that, to my knowledge, is one of the very few communities that's done that. You contrast that with what's happened with tornadoes. When I was a child growing up in the Midwest, just about every building in the Midwest, homes at least, had a storm shelter. We had a storm shelter that we went every time there was an earthquake watch out, and we were safe. Now people live in manufactured homes, and there used to be a joke that tornadoes found mobile home communities. Well, they didn't, but mobile home communities were disproportionately harmed by tornadoes. And now with the building standards the way they are, and fewer people living in well-built homes that can withstand the intensity of tornadoes, more and more people are being put in harm's way. We have to reverse this trend and put in standards for areas of the country that are subject to tornadoes the same way we have with earthquakes.
Bill has a go ahead.
Interesting prospect for me, speaking of sea level rise, is I like James Hansen's book, Storms of My Grandchildren, a lot. And one of the things that was news to me in there was, he says that basically once the sea level starts moving, it'll just keep moving. It isn't like it's going to get lower or higher and then stay there. That the dynamics of the system have been incredibly stable for on the order of thousands of years. But once that shifts, it stays shifted. So you've not only got the poor people of the world going to places like Bangladesh, which are subject to any kind of sea level action and more typhoons and so on, but basically most of the people who can go where they want to are going to the coast for the amenities. And so you got civilization moving to cities and moving to coasts, and to the extent that those are vulnerable places, that does indeed paint the picture for the next century or two.
Let's make clear that we're dealing with two different kinds of problems here, and they're both really important and really interesting. And the one is, how do we deal with hazards on the world that we know? And in some ways, Joel points out and others point out, we're getting better at that. And in certain ways, the most important thing I think that we're getting better at is just having more information. The internet has been the most useful safety device and the cell phone in the world. That's why when there's a big typhoon in Bangladesh now, it kills a few thousand people, not a few 100,000 people, because there's enough cell phone warning to get people into rudimentary shelters. So one imagines that human ingenuity, being what it is, will continue trying to figure out smart, wise ways to lessen those. The other problem that we're dealing with is taking that world that we've known for quite a while and changing it in for another world that operates very differently, that has more energy in the system, that takes us out of the Holocene and into the Anthropocene or whatever we're going to call it. And that's the world where all bets are off, and where if we go down that path, there's no reason to think that our kind of particular savvy and things will be enough to even begin to cope with the changes that are coming. Think about, when people at Stanford and University of Washington say we can expect 30% fall in grain yields over the course of the century if we let the temperature go up the way it seems set to go up at the moment, that's not a disaster for which any sort of human ingenuity is going to help us very much. That's the one that leaves us in enormous, enormous trouble. And so the prevention of that is, it just seems to me, the overriding priority. Trying to keep that next slug of carbon from going into the atmosphere that's going to drive us past those thresholds. I'm reasonably confident that, all things being equal, we'll get better at dealing with hazards because we have over time, but I'm not at all confident that we can cope with that other world. And that's why it makes so much sense to put every priority we can into slowing down its arrival and making it as close to the world that we know as we possibly can.
What do you see in China that you don't see elsewhere? What do you see in China that you don't see elsewhere?
Well, all kinds of things. I was just
in relation to the issues we're talking about.
I was just in fact, this is a good chance to give a plug for one of our, for the sponsors of this enterprise. I have a piece in the current issue, I believe, of the Geographic on China and energy.
Outstanding.
And China's fascinating. It's, the best and the worst. They're putting coal in at an unprecedented pace. It's as dark in that sense as you can imagine. And they're putting green in at an unprecedented pace. They're leading the world in renewable energy. And some of it is painful for an American to see. The guy who runs the biggest solar.
It says, can China go green? But where is the byline is my question, okay? You have to hunt for the byline in this magazine, I've noticed over the years. Anyway.
That's all right, they pay pretty well.
That's right.
Here's the anecdote that really got me. The guy who runs Hemin Solar, the solar hot water company, they've put in more solar, something like 250 million Chinese when they take a shower. Apparently the hot water is coming off the roof. Well, one of the things this guy has in his private museum now is a solar hot water panel from the roof of the Carter White House, the one that Ronald Reagan took down in the 1980s, okay? We had a reasonable chance at getting ahead of this problem a long time ago, and we didn't do it because of short-sightedness and, frankly, because of greed and the power of the fossil fuel industry. And now we're, in a place we shouldn't have had to be. And we're starting to catch up. Barack Obama promised last fall, after we tried to make an issue of it, he promised that he would have solar panels on the White House this spring, which gives him, by my watch, 3 weeks left to go. We'll see, and we'll begin the process that Jimmy Carter started in 1978 all over again, and see if we can't catch up a little.
I want to talk about technology for a minute. Marcia, last year, when the Macondo well blew out, BP and its contractors were fundamentally not ready for that event. It caught them blindsided, even though oil wells have been blowing out since about the time of the Civil War. I mean, this is something that is well known in the industry that this can happen. Why was BP so unprepared? And what I'm leading to here is how robust is the technology of deep water drilling based on what you saw? And in general, how should those of us who are not technologically, we're not engineers, how confident should we be in these big engineered systems like deep water drilling, frankly, like the electrical grid, like nuclear power? And I'll get to you with Stewart in a second about that, because you've been a proponent of nuclear power. I want to ask you if that's safe. I mean, how robust is our technology, our engineering, based on what you saw last year?
Well, the failure of the Macondo well was a perfect example of a very complex system that failed in an unanticipated way. The tests that they did on it, they thought they had a safe well, and they didn't. The tests were faulty. And then in any kind of situation like that, it's not one thing that goes wrong, but several things went wrong, and they all went wrong in sequence, such that you had a major disaster. And as our technology gets more and more complex, there's always the chance that these things will go wrong together and cause a disaster.
Is the market helpful in this regard, or does it hurt? In other words, if you're an oil company, and yes, this is a very, very big, rich, powerful industry. I think it's the most powerful, richest industry on the planet, even more so than finance. I remember last summer, in the middle of the oil spill, Bob Dudley, who is now the CEO of BP, said, people don't realize how many resources we have. People don't realize how rich these companies are. Not just rich, but just resources, infrastructure, how deep their pockets are. They could take a $40 billion hit on that oil spill, and
Joel, let me paraphrase something from MIT professor Nancy Levison, who's an expert in industrial safety. And I was on a panel with her, and she said something very important. She said, sure, these are complex systems, but so is a nuclear submarine. So is an airplane. And no one would argue that if you are a human passenger inside a nuclear submarine cruising at 100 meters below the ocean surface, or if you're a passenger in an airliner flying up at 30,000 feet, that you can survive if suddenly your envelope disintegrates around you. And yet, since after the Thresher accident, the U.S. Navy decided never again. And they put every effort into making nuclear submarines absolutely fail-safe. And the aircraft industry has put every ounce of their energy into making aircraft travel safe, because they knew that all of us would not fly in airplanes unless they did not have an exemplary safety record. And that's the case. And yet, as Joel said, oil wells blow out all the time. And it's simply because the industry hasn't put the effort into making them safe, and no one has made them put the effort into making them safe. They could do it if they wanted to.
Stewart, what about nuclear power? Did Fukushima change your ideas at all about the attractiveness of nuclear power as part of the equation going forward?
Well, if only Fukushima had changed the climate change situation, that would absolutely, but it didn't. Like 3 Mile Island, it's what they call the lessons learned moment. But it's lessons learned on various sides. One of the expectation for a while in anti-nuclear people is that, boy, if you get a meltdown, thousands of people will die. Well, this is a way worse scenario than that. We had 3 old reactors simultaneously melt down and a pool screw up. and hydrogen explosions. And people were a little distracted because there was a 9.0 earthquake and 46-foot tsunami that had just come through. And nobody died from the radiation. One of the reasons for that is, one of the only good things about radiation is that it's really easy to measure. And we know a lot about acute doses now so that you can get people away from where it's too hot and do the workarounds to manage it with robots and so on. So that's fantastic, great, okay. And the other surprising thing is that while the Fukushima Daiichi reactors had these terrible problems, the other Fukushima plant, just I guess a few miles up the coast, had the same tsunami happen, no problems there. The difference being that instead of built in 1971, the reactors there were built in 1980s. So, you know, is there progress over time? The Thresher accident happened, and then the industry learned. The same thing has gone on, obviously, with airplanes. Every now and then they crash, and then they don't crash the same way the next time. So, on the other hand, TEPCO will probably go down. The Japanese government will probably go down. The cost of cleaning up the mess that was made was horrendous. The evacuation area will probably have to stay empty in varying degrees for at least months, in some places maybe years. All of that's really bad news in terms of nuclear. So 3 countries said, okay, that's it for us. Germany said, we're shutting down nuclear. Good luck with that. And because they're going to be buying nuclear electricity from Republic of Czechoslovakia and from France, of course, who's not shutting down its nukes. And Switzerland and Italy have both said, we're going to rethink nuclear. All the rest of the people that are building nukes are saying, pay close attention, learn the lessons, move into newer reactors that don't have that kind of problem.
All right, we're going to go to questions from the audience, unless there's something else anyone wants to jump in and add to follow up. Okay, questions. Who's got a question out there? And should they come to the microphone here and there? Is that the plan? What's the plan? Yes, the gentleman says yes. All right. Yes, right here.
It's on. Okay. Good evening. My name is Orin Edwards and I'm from Jamaica. I've heard some very powerful statements. One was by Mr. Brand, which was that environmental change affects all things we care about. Another one was that we should consciously manage the planet. Now, after hearing all these statements, my question is, what is it that you guys are doing population growth, population development? Through the discussion, I haven't heard anything repopulation, so I'd like to know something a little bit more about that.
So let me answer part of that. So managing the planet actually means managing ourselves. And population automatically is part of that. And of course, we have the new UN projections which say we'll reach 7 billion, ironically on Halloween, right? And that instead of ending up with 9 billion, we're more likely to end up with 10. It's a really serious challenge. Well, that's what the UN is projecting, that's all.
It's based on the idea that we get back to replacement birth rate, which is not happening anywhere.
So you think it's worse? Okay.
No.
You think it's better?
Oh, yeah. Peak by the 2040s and head seriously and problematically downhill after that.
But the point is there still is only so much land.
Not enough people?
Right?
Some countries are already complaining and trying to get across the board, Australia, Spain, Germany.
Call it 9 or
Italy,
call it
trying
10.
to get more kids.
You got to feed these people, right? And that takes a lot of land, big challenge for agriculture. And we need that land for other purposes as well. So
Here, I agree on that.
So it's a real issue, and it's built right into what we think about.
Andy Revkin over here.
Yeah, hey, Andy Revkin, .Earth blog, Pace University. You brought up the Tsunami Stones in Japan, and I was really struck by that when I wrote about the Tsunami Stones and how people just forgot about them in just 3 generations. There seems to be a 3-generation rule, basically. A reader asked a really daunting question. The question came in, wow, if we're so bad at reading the concrete lessons of history, where this coast in 1932 actually was hit by a devastating tsunami, one part of it, how can we expect humanity to read the lessons being articulated by climate scientists looking forward several generations and saying, hey, you know, there's really big bad stuff coming, you know, some of it relates to what you've seen. So this gets to something I've been writing a lot about, which is, maybe you could each express your thinking about whether we do need some help is our cognitive toolkit. If you took away the disinformation, there's a lot of evidence that we're not simply suddenly magically going to decarbonize. So do we need some help of some kind? Whether it's a couch and a good shrink or what? Or
I think we're onto something here.
You know, one thing I can say about that is that from the studies that have been done about why so many people are not acting, is that if you take the simple example of the Montreal Protocol, there was something very simple that people could do about the ozone hole, and that is stop using aerosols. They could switch from non-freon products, and there was a very simple message to people of what they could do. It was commercially available, problem solved. And the problem with the climate issue is that there are too many mixed messages going out there as to the actions that people take. There's a lot of statements out there about all the things that are going wrong, and scientists, and I'll take responsibility for this, are our own worst enemies about doom and gloom. These are all the things that are going wrong. This is the bad future, but we aren't giving enough messages about this is what you should do and simple actions you can take and change your lifestyle, and that it's actionable, possible, and economically viable.
That's true. That's good, but it's also, I mean, at this point, it's pretty clear that it's not going to be a sort of individual. We're not going to do this additively. You know, like people changing their light bulbs isn't going to add up. It's going to be some kind of political action in the end, attaching some serious price to carbon being the first part along the way.
But it's got to start at the individual level, because otherwise politicians aren't going to do it.
And so, but I think Andy's question is a good one, whether we have this sort of mental toolkit or not to deal with this. And I got to say, I sort of hinted at this earlier, I've been pleasantly surprised by how many people are able to, and are able to deal with the science pretty straightforwardly. And I think the reason is, when we tell people about 350, as we have all over the world, it's not that people have a deep understanding of the carbon cycle. It's more like when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, your cholesterol level is too high. You're, in the zone where people have heart attacks. And, very few people then turn to the doctor and say, I need an entire understanding of the lipid cycle before I listen to you. And only an idiot, goes home and searches the internet to find some doctor who says cholesterol doesn't exist, or something like that. There seems to be some ability of people to really, get this. And the wild card that we have, thank you, Stewart, it really is the internet as I mean, it causes lots of problems and spreads lots of disinformation, but overall, we're closer to having some kind of global sense of what's going on than we were not that long ago.
Hang on one second. Andy's question, though, I believe, gets back to the issue of why didn't Japan see this coming and better than it did. This event was an earthquake that created this massive wall of water that killed something like 25,000 people and obliterated these whole communities. And then it caused an electrical outage at this nuclear power plant because they lost the grid, then they lost the backup generators, they got flooded, and now they have no electricity. And that system with 6 reactors was incapable of cooling the nuclear fuel rods if it did not have electricity. And you could just come in and plug in some new generators because the switch yard was flooded too. So you had, I guess, I mean, this was an anomalous event in the sense that there hadn't been a tsunami that big or an event that big since 869. That was according to the monastic record. So it's a 1,000-year event. So I guess, and I hope I'm not misinterpreting this, are we capable of being prepared for the ultimate black swan 1,000-year thing that comes out of deep time and hits us, or we're just psychologically we're never going to be ready for that?
But weren't those generators really quite close to sea level? So you didn't need a big tsunami for that to be a problem?
Well, there was a sea wall that was designed with the notion in mind that the wall was big enough to handle any potential wave coming in. And I don't know the exact calculations about that, but I know that was based on the seismic hazard maps that had been developed.
One of the problems is, of course, that we do things that we do things cheaply when we can get away with it. And that, I mean, think about what maybe the fundamental flaw at that nuclear plant may have been the fact that, and it never occurred to me until this thing happened, that they put 6 of them right next to each other, so that when the first one got in trouble, you couldn't even go in to look at the other ones, And of course they did that because it was cheaper to do it that way, and of course you built on the floodplain because floodplains are nice and flat and easy, cheap to build on and whatever else. So we have some tools that can help us and do sometimes. Insurance being a good example, right, if we use it wisely. Or in the case of carbon, we know enough to put a serious price on carbon, and that could help us make those set of decisions differently.
And by the way, there is a new generation of nuclear reactor that employs just water running downhill and then evaporating as a cooling mechanism, no electricity necessary. And this is, straight out of the 17th century or something. So gravity is this new concept they came up with. I think you're next over here.
Okay. Hi, my name's Steve Bruner. I'm from Bozeman, Montana. I'm frustrated by the politics behind these issues and the fact that change is hard to come by. Bill, you mentioned something when you were speaking earlier. We know we're doing things wrong. We all can agree on that. Now we just need to stop doing those things. And I'm wondering, at this point, do we agree? How if you went to Washington, what are we seeing now? Is it really politics on different sides of the aisle, or is there actually agreement? And what can we agree on?
No, there's not agreement in Washington. I mean, Washington's been going steadily backwards. George H.W. Bush in 1988, running for president, said he was going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. A good line. 3 weeks ago, the House of Representatives defeated by a 60-vote margin a resolution that simply said climate change was real. And it goes across the board. The guy who won the Senate seat from West Virginia, a Democrat last fall, did it with an ad where he took his deer rifle and shot a copy of the climate legislation. And this does not reflect, what this reflects most of all, again, is the power of the fossil fuel industry. It's the Koch brothers who funded the Tea Party. It's, ExxonMobil, who made more money last year than any company in the history of money, who have, as we now understand, supplied an enormous amount of the funding for the various disinformation groups and think tanks and things out there. This is a serious battle with the most, as Joel pointed out, the most potent economic force on the planet. And that makes it very hard. One of the things that's interesting is, since we work around the world, is to see that it's very different other places. The US is the place where this is most obvious. When you go to the UK, the new Tory government in the UK just adopted a quite interesting and ambitious climate plan. Angela Merkel, the conservative premier of Germany, has been pretty, she didn't, when she took office, she didn't announce that she had her own physics and chemistry and she wasn't going to deal with this anymore, she got to work. So in this country, where that political power of that disinformation lobby is at the highest, that's a huge problem.
Over here on the left.
One of the interesting things about the congruence between those in the Congress who don't believe in climate change and those who don't believe in evolution is you have the makings there of a giant experiment to prove natural selection.
On the left over here.
Daniel Lossie from Omaha, Nebraska and Veritas Group. My question, I think, is hitting at a fundamental question I've had for a long time. And we talk about the technology. We have the technology to make subs safer, airplanes safer, wells safer. We have technology to do renewable energies. All of these, what I'll call advanced new technologies, take energy themselves. And most of them right now are using fossil fuels in some form or fashion. So is there a balance between the technology will save us all and the what I would call more traditional technologies using lower energy inputs? We talked about gravity. That's a technology, but it's more of an ancient technology, if you will. Are these new high energy intense fossil fuel based technologies really going to be a solution to some of these disasters or preventing them?
Who wants to jump in? Stewart, you want to talk about that? Or you want to jump in?
Dams use gravity. I sort of have mixed emotions about there's a dam being taken down in the Olympic Peninsula shortly, and the salmon will be so happy, and that's great. On the other hand, there's a lot of electricity coming out of that dam that was greenhouse gas free. That will now have to be replaced with something that is probably greenhouse gas intensive. This keeps happening. It's interesting that environmentalists are moving from being able to be kind of absolutists about things to having to get into a little this, a little that, negotiation, risk balancing, all this kind of thing. And it used to be all you had to do was think globally and act locally. And so lots of people who are thinking globally and acting locally are preventing solar farms from going up, wind farms from going up in Nantucket Sound and things like that, because that's the local thing to do. My guess is that we're moving in the direction of, and people in this panel and in this room will help get us there, of actually everybody has to act globally and adjust locally and put up with a few things, like maybe keeping the dam a little longer because it's greenhouse gas free, or putting up with there goes the view on Nantucket Sound, but you're getting greenhouse gas electricity out of those wind generators. This is a shift which is century scale, and it's tough for a movement that has gotten a certain momentum and confidence about how it behaves to make that big a shift, but it's what's going on. That probably doesn't answer your question at all.
It was a very good question, by the way. I think that we're all like, you answer it. It's such a hard question. No, I mean, fossil fuels are very useful. They're causing a problem, but they're very useful.
Directly, the question is, we can make, it costs some fossil fuel to make solar panels, but the lifetime of that solar panel will more than pay it back. The thing that's starting to happen that's going to be very interesting, I think, is a change in our conception of how we do energy. And what the engineers call distributed generation, a sort of energy system that mimics the internet or that mimics the farmer's market, as opposed to the highly centralized system that we're used to now, is, I think, what's coming. That'll be interesting.
Small modular reactors.
I didn't say it.
And Bill has a new book.
Unless you call it, the solar panel on my roof a small, I'm a little utility, and I'm very happy to be a little solar utility.
Bill has a new book out called Earth, and it's EAARTH, and I highly recommend it. But what about cities, Bill? I mean, you talk about the sort of farmer's market model of energy. I mean, what do you do about Manhattan?
Well, look, think about New York. 100 years ago, I wrote a long piece once about where everything in my apartment from New York came from, for the New Yorker, so I thought about this a lot. 100 years ago, there were more people in New York than there are at the moment, and they were not completely self-sufficient, but they call New Jersey the Garden State for a reason, You're growing lots and lots of food there. 2/3 of the food in this country is grown in adjacent to metropolitan areas. It just now that disappears into a big commodity food stream. Energy, the same way. You're not going to put wind turbines, in Central Park, but there's an immense amount of wind blowing out in Long Island Sound. And in fact, people are beginning the work of building the interconnections and the big $6 zillion transmission cable up and down the East Coast and whatever else that's going to make some of that possible.
Okay, quick question. After this, are we gathering somewhere? Is there an announcement to be made? Does anyone have an announcement? Okay, there's going to be an announcement. There'll be an explanation. All right, well, I've gotten this signal from my superior over here that we're going to have to wrap this up. But we'll be lurking around if you want to ask the panelists any more questions. And I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank everyone for coming.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, panelists. I wish this could just go on, but it can't. Bill, we're sorry that you're going to have to leave. We would have enjoyed having you around for the next few days. A couple of things. For those of you who are full participants in the Environment Forum, we have a